what I'm really going to talk about actually is demographics and how demographics um, lock into people's views on values and on politics, and how that political pattern is changing. Um, if you take all of the demographic data that we have on people, if you take all the demographic data we have on people, you throw away all the polling and just look at the actual census data, the demographics, and if you organise each of our demographic characteristics on two axes, you create a model that explains over 80% of voting behaviour. And the two axes, for simplicity, we call one security, one is diversity. Security is basically all the demographic characteristics and features of economic security. So it's income, wealth, occupation, home ownership, health, things like that, which add up to economic well-being. The other axis is diversity, which is much more straightforwardly what it says it is. It's racial, ethnic, religious, cultural diversity, and very significantly density. Population per hectare is a very important flag on voting behaviour. Now, if you create that model and you look at 2015, what you find is, unsurprisingly, intuitively, the Tory party won in 2015 by dominating the bits of Britain that are non-diverse and well-off. And the Labour Party's centre of gravity is in the bits of Britain which are poorer and much more diverse. Completely obvious that is the traditional left-right economic divide. But when you look at this country and you look at other countries around the world through that lens, what you see is that the axis is rotating. So, for example, if we look at America, at every election since 1980 in America, the average Republican voter has remained just as non-diverse, i.e. just as white, but as becoming steadily, on average, less well-educated, less well-off, and less healthy, while the average Democrat voter has been becoming better off, healthier, better educated, while remaining just as non-diverse, just as diverse. In the referendum, we saw the same pattern here. The sort of centrifugal point of the Remain vote was in the bits of Britain which are diverse and also well-off. The heartland of the Leave vote was in the bits of Britain which are relatively poor, relatively poorly educated, and relatively unhealthy, but also definitively very white. Now, in 2017, the election we had earlier this year, we saw in this country the same rotation of the axis that we've seen in America. The average Conservative vote in just 2 years since 2015 became quite significantly poorer, less well-educated, less healthy, and even less diverse than it had been before, Labour moving in the opposite direction. Now, what's interesting, when you then overlay that with a set of values, because on the one hand, you've got a very tight fit in terms of interlocking demographics, which align with people's voting behaviour, but those demographics also align with people's values, thinking big picture here, not policies, but deep values, worldviews. So, example, we did a big poll, 20,000 sample poll in the UK, 30,000 in America, with this question. Do you think of the following things as being a force for good, or a force for ill, or a mixed blessing? And the things were multiculturalism, immigration, social liberalism, feminism, the green movement, and the internet. And if you think that all of those things are a force for ill in the world, there's an almost 100% probability that you also told us that you voted for Donald Trump in America and for Brexit in Britain. If you think that they're all a force for good, there's an almost 0% probability that you did that. So there's a deep divide in values terms which aligns with the demographics. And what's happening at the moment is that the energy in political systems is reacting fundamentally to globalization, but is pulling centre-right parties from their traditional heartland based on economic left and right to one which is much more dominated by diversity. The fact that the Tory voters become poorer, less well-educated, and even less diverse, what that means is that the diversity bit of the axis is starting to be more significant. In other words, people are now deciding how to vote on the basis of the communities that they live in and how diverse those are, regardless of their economic situation. And so you're seeing that rotation. That's why in the general election we saw Labour win in some very safe traditional Conservative seats, and the places where the Tories gained votes were predominantly in the bits of Britain that are poorly educated and less well off, and what that means is that the policy agenda of the party is being pulled towards what, to use Tony Blair's parlance, is a closed view of the world rather than an open view of the world. And I think that represents a massive challenge for people who believe in, as it were, open rather than closed. People who think that the internet and feminism and the green movement are forces for good. That there's a battle on to persuade people drifting towards the closed view of the world that open is in their interest too. And at the moment, I think people who believe in open are losing the argument.
Okie doke. We're going to move on to the next speaker, so make sure to keep your questions for later on. So what are the biggest challenges facing the world is what Jamie's going to be talking about. He is a tech blogger for The Telegraph and recently presented a documentary on Silicon Valley. So over to you.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Shall I sit down? Or is it what's easier? I'll sit down. Okay. So I also wrote a book about radical political movements. So I'm going to say something about that because I think that the last 18 months, which we can all agree has been pretty turbulent, I think is really just the beginning of a pretty major reconstruction of how our politics works and what is considered to be normal. And that is because three very big trends are going to really quite fundamentally change what is the political mainstream. And the first is technological. And I think our economies are going to change fundamentally in the next 20 years. The second is environmental, and we are not going to be able to maintain control of our borders with the mass movement of people that is surely coming in the next 2 decades. And the third is attitudinal, and you already heard from Lord Cooper what some of that is, but also the collapsing trust in representative democracy as a system of government among people born in the 1980s and 1970s. Combine those things together, and it's more important than just the Conservative Party. I think we're talking about the future of representative democracies as a way that people believe problems can be solved. I want to just say 3 things about the technological challenges, though. And the first one is about direct democracy. I think it is going to be an unstoppable force, a demand to use the internet to introduce more types of direct democracy into our parliamentary or political systems. The difference between people's ordinary lives as citizens and lives as consumers and lives as citizens is getting to be ridiculous. We have so little say in how our politics functions compared to other aspects of our lives. And for people that have grown up with the internet, that is ludicrous. The problem is the assumption in the 1990s was always that if we had more information, more connectivity, more voices, we'd all be nicer to each other and we'd be more informed and our politics would be gentler and better. And it sounds like a sick joke now. And the reason is, when we are overwhelmed with information, the truth is we stop relying on our analytical brain and we rely on our emotional side. And that, I think, is what partly explains what is clearly a polarization of politics over the last few years. And it's not just that we all sit in little echo chambers online, it's also that we see our opponents as acting always in bad faith. And I think what this means, as more and more direct democracy is introduced, politics is going to become more emotional. And it's going to be more about grand statements and what sort of person you are. And that is very important for the Conservative Party and indeed for all of them. The second challenge is censorship. Theresa May is recently in, was it Washington or I think it was in Washington, wasn't it? Oh no, New York for UNGA, talking about the big tech firms doing more to clamp down on terrorist content. In 5 years' time, we will look back wistfully about the time that there were companies we could speak to about censoring internet content, because we are entering into a time in which censorship of the internet is not going to be possible. It's going to change fundamentally. We're going to have a much more decentralized internet, and censorship will not be an option. Imagine what it means to live in a world in which censorship of all types of information is no longer possible. You cannot rely on it, and instead you are going to have to rely much more on people being critical thinkers for themselves. And our education system is still nowhere near up to that task. IT in schools is still fundamentally taught as how do you use software, how do you use Microsoft Word and all the rest of it. And it has to be about how do you be a good digital citizen. And the final thing is artificial intelligence. And it's amazing how in the last 18 months everyone's talking about this. I started a centre at Demos that specialises in machine learning 5 years ago. No one knew what that word meant. And now everyone's talking about it all the time. I'm a bit annoyed, actually, because I feel like this is my turf, get off. Now, machine learning, artificial intelligence is going to, we all now kind of agree, is going to change our economies in fundamental ways. But I think everyone obsesses over jobs. Are we going to lose jobs or are we going to gain jobs? More important than that, because we really don't know, more important than that is how it will change the structure of our economies. Big data and artificial intelligence, I think, tends towards monopolies, because any industry or any company that is very good at big data analytics or artificial intelligence will be very good in nearly every industry. So Google will be a world leader, not just in search, but in driverless vehicles, in medical research, in logistics, and all sorts of other stuff besides. That could create a barbell-shaped economy where you have some very, very lucrative tech jobs at the top and rather more less lucrative, non-automated service industry jobs at the bottom, and a big kind of gap in the middle. And that, I think, is the big challenge. How does a Conservative Party or any party respond to that? The Conservative Party, to its credit, I think, has been the best of all the parties at trying to sketch out the possibilities and potentials for this new industry and talk about how important it's going to be in post-Brexit Britain, and it will be. Jesus.
Good note to end on.
But we have to think about the social consequences, because big society Britain needs more than a very, very sort of segregated economy.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Right, I think it's a good moment to move on to Alex, who is here on behalf of BuzzFeed, to talk about the changes that we're seeing in the media. So, obviously he will elaborate, but in a nutshell, I work in comms myself. There's still a sense that if you want to get good coverage, you want it to be in print. However, this is changing. Where's the readership, and especially where are the younger voters that we need to tap into? What are they reading, and which sources are they using? So, Alex.
Hi. So I've got a few loose thoughts on the themes that Andrew laid out, but from a media perspective. I cover UK politics at BuzzFeed. I'm not partisan. I'm just a reporter. So these are just a reporter's observations. This came about because I just wrote an enormous profile of George Freeman, the organizer, and it's unreadably long. Sorry about that. In one of our many conversations, we got to the end of it, and we got talking about media, and I said, George, why do you guys, Tory MPs, all you do is op-eds for the Telegraph? You know that nobody under 70 reads this, right? And you were just talking to other Tory MPs, and then we got on to talking about what was going on in social media. BuzzFeed is one of the new generation of digital media publications that's set up for the social world. So we follow very closely what's being shared. Sharing is the currency in this new world. And I was saying to George, you guys are getting absolutely hosed, and you don't even know it. So just step back a second. The biggest problem that seems to me at the moment, like Andrew said, the Conservative Party has lost a generation to the opposition. Now, when you look at where those people under 40 are typically, how they're getting their news now, those people don't tend to get their news from newspapers. They're mostly getting it from the internet, and Facebook is probably the biggest single source. So during the election, we were tracking the political stories in the UK that were getting shared, and it was really striking. Almost uniformly anti-conservative, and you sort of have to go right down into maybe number 85 to find a story that's remotely positive about the Conservative Party. Anti-Tory and pro-Corbyn dominates. When you look at the publications that are getting traction, very often they're new publications that often literally have been set up by a guy in his bedroom at no cost. He's got no track record in journalism, and you probably wouldn't have heard of most of these publications. And they are they're out muscling the the established legacy media that you would have all heard of and that we all pay attention to. Not exclusively. The Independent has sort of reinvented itself quietly online as a pro-Corbyn clickbait factory. The Mirror does very well as well, and so we've been looking at it. We follow this very, very closely, and since the election, this hasn't changed. If anything, the trend is deepening. Things that are very striking when you look at it. I mean, the takeaway, I think it's extremely serious because the tone is so anti your party that it's not people complaining about your policies. The sort of subtext is these are bad people, and I think that's pretty bad. If you look at this, the takeaway I think is that the brand, if it was ever detoxified, has retoxified. And it's deepening, and it's around things that don't necessarily get a lot of attention from the Westminster bubble. So the sort of conversations that I have on a daily basis with people in and around the party, with other journalists, the things that we focus on day to day in the political lobby, what we consider to be the big story of the day, often in this environment is not the stuff that's resonating. So one thing that was really notable during the election that cut through very, very strongly was fox hunting. Now, I don't know whether to your average Conservative member, whether that was considered to be a hot button issue, but I can tell you that really cut very, very deeply on social media, and there's a lot around the public sector pay freeze. Grenfell hurt you very, very deeply. It all sort of playing to the notion that these are people with malevolent intent. They don't care about public services. They only care about the establishment, the elites. And I have no valuable suggestions for you on how to counter that. But what my strong impression from talking to a lot of people in and around the party is that you're not really looking at this and need to be.
Thank you. So, Chloe Smith, the MP for Norwich North and also the Minister for Northern Ireland. I think we can probably squeeze a couple of minutes in. He hasn't heard me. Right. Chloe, thank you very much indeed.
So I get the unenviable task of speaking last, wrapping it up and doing it in 5 minutes, which means you guys don't get to ask me any hard questions, which I'm quite happy with, considering everything that's already been said today. First of all, thank you to the fellow contributors. Some incredibly valuable stuff has been said today from you and everybody in the audience, so thank you for having me be part of this. George asked me to be part of this because I am one of that relatively small band of people in Generation Y who are elected politicians. I'm 35. I was first elected when I was 27. There are some others. So, for example, actually, Craig, give us a wave over there. Craig also has been one of this band. We're sorry that you're not with us at present. We will have you back. And it's occasionally been quite a tough argument to our party to be able to say that there is this problem coming down the track. The conclusion from today's talks is very clearly there is a problem. You're not going to find me denying that. But the good news, as it were, is that actually the party has already very publicly accepted this. If you look at Damien Green's words to Bright Blue, in fact, very shortly after the election, he was categorically accepting that that some of the roots of the problem that we just had at the election 2017 lay in these themes of age, of education, of what he was referring to as metropolitan Britain. So Andrew's analysis and the points that have been made are, I think, very much accepted. So I just want to add a few points to them for today on reflection. One is that the problem is going to get worse. And Andrew teed this up. Andrew and I have worked together on some analysis where we set out to crack that old thing that you'll hear some very complacent people say, where they say, oh, it's fine, people will vote Conservative when they get older. I'm going to let that giggle, that embarrassed, slightly embarrassed giggle roll its way around the room, because we've all heard people in the Conservative Party say that. And I have no doubt that actually, to be fair, on the left, on the centre-left, there are some equivalent complacencies to that one. The big parties like to think that it will all be okay. Now, what we are seeing, as Andrew's trailed, then is a building set of cohorts that are choosing not to vote Conservative. That concept has now built up to where the leading age group there is as high as 45, and the point is there is not a replacement system. It is not that we should expect people to suddenly change their values and their vote in later life. It has been a complacency and a fallacy to think that people to date have become Conservatives as they got older. That's not what's happened. We have some work that suggests that in fact the Conservative Party took a large number of voters for their first time, the first time voters of 1992, and prior to that 1979, so 2 peaks, and those are still with us, and we're incredibly grateful for their support and their vote. But that is not the same as people having got older and become more conservative. It is the case that there are cohorts who have remained conservative. So that's why the problem is going to get worse. And as you can hear, I'm focusing particularly on the age point. There are many other aspects to the problem that have been discussed here today. So what should we be doing? The thing I will say about the solution here is that it is going to have to be a very large solution. It has to be a complete solution, doesn't it? It has to go across policy, across language, across campaigning techniques, across leadership, across values. It has to be a complete solution. It has to be an authentic one. That is one of the other watchwords that we haven't particularly delved into today, but is very important in all of this. It's my view that the Conservative Party can rise to that challenge, and that we have the seeds of some of that actually in some of the content I think we'll be having here today. If I just took a couple of examples on the values front, if you looked at the keenness of people younger than me, certainly younger than probably most of us in this room, to think in terms of identity politics, to think in terms of a very pronounced type of diversity, and to really be very almost quite militant about a set of labels and a set of vocabulary. Now, as Conservatives, we don't much go in for labels. That's actually kind of the thing we like least of all. We very strongly stand against that. But we do stand passionately for that value of self-determination. You should have the right and the freedom to describe yourself and to live your life however the hell you like. We believe in that very, very, very strongly. So there is a seed of something else that is present in today's politics, where in fact we have a Conservative opportunity. We also believe very, very strongly, as I say, in freedom of choice. And you see that actually coming through in something Jamie was referring to earlier on. Jamie, you were saying, well, we have a lot of say in everything else in our lives. Absolutely correct, we do. Now, again, as Conservatives, we think that is a good thing. There is something there that is present in today's world that we have to do more of. I think that whistle is for me like it is for everybody else. A final values point, and then I'll hand the mic back. And it's the age-old question of the role of society. Every Conservative, really, I think, is probably looking to challenge themselves to think of, well, what's the successor to what Margaret Thatcher had to say about society, to the thing that David Cameron developed on and said, there is such a thing as society, it's just not the same as the state. Now, we've heard a great example already this morning with North London Cares, and indeed you probably could put things like TripAdvisor or Wikipedia in the same category. Already, throughout society, we are using, and very happily using, crowd-based tools to achieve certain tasks. Arguably, they do the job very much better than centrally planned tools. I would say Wikipedia is a case in point of that. Is that me causing that noise, or is that somebody else? Okay, thanks. Indeed. Never let me be the one to stand in the way of the Prime Minister. So we have this question. We have this question about what is the role of society. It is an eternal question for Conservatives. We here in this tent today, like anybody else, want to develop that question and have the fresh answer for it. We have the opportunity to do that, and we have the seeds of what people are already doing throughout society in a conservative manner, if only we can find the tools to correctly express that and pull that forward for a fresh generation.
Great. Thank you very much, Chloe.